So welcome everyone. We'll start the presentation very shortly. The session is being recorded and it will last about 60 minutes. We'll have 45 minutes worth of presentation, or about 45 minutes worth of presentation, followed by time for questions and answers. Please make sure to keep your microphone muted during the presentation. And we also ask that you please turn off your cameras during the presentation. If you'd like to turn them on during the question and answer period, that would be fine. But for recording purposes, we want to have just the cameras of our presenters be on during the presentation. If you have a question or a comment, please make sure to enter it into the chat during the presentation, and it will be addressed during the question and answer period after our speakers are finished. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version of the presentation, which will be available within 1 week after the event takes place. My name is Dr. Catherine Showalter, and I'll be the moderator for today's presentation. TESOL International Association Speech, Pronunciation, and Listening Interest section is pleased to present this webinar titled Perception, Pronunciation, Orthography, and High Variability Phonetic Training in Foreign Language. Our speakers today are Dr. John H.G. Scott and Lisa Zusenbach, both from the University of Calgary. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar. And now it is my pleasure to hand over this presentation to our speakers.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out. So we're going to jump right into it by giving you an overview of how we're going to proceed. We'll start with an overview of phonological knowledge of segments in general, kind of how the pieces fit together. And then we're going to go into some review of some of the big ideas in perception and production in L2 phonology studies, and as well as exemplar theory, and how these all end up relating to an interesting and promising new treatment, or not necessarily new, but emerging treatment called high variability phonetic training and its relative low variability phonetic training. And then we'll finish by sharing some information about studies that we have currently going on or are planning to have at the University of Calgary in the near future in that format. So first, I wanted to say that today we're going to focus on segments. This is, to acknowledge that phonology is a really big thing. There's a lot of stuff in it. So we have just segments, the individual sounds, and then a phonotactics, which is how they fit together or how they're allowed to fit together in a particular language. And we also have super segmentals like syllable prominence, stress, pitch, accent, tone, and then phrasal and sentential intonation as well. But today we're really just going to focus on segments. So one piece of a much larger puzzle dealing with acquisition. So first, let's take a look at perception, production, and orthography and how they relate to each other and kind of how they relate to the things we're going to talk about today. So we have perception. In perception, we get a whole bunch of varieties of a sound that come in from our environment. They vary based on context or speaker and that sort of thing. And that's not just a matter of some linguistic symbol that we get in, but they actually tend to, we're going to talk today about how we store a lot of information about these examples that we get in our speech exposure, including things like who spoke them, which can influence how we perceive them and how important we consider them in our internal phonological grammar. With production, we also produce a wide variety of variations on a sound when we speak, and that's going to, again, be due to context and who we are and our ability to articulate a particular sound mechanically in our mouths. And then this plays into big questions for instructors in assessment in terms of accentedness or intelligibility and comprehensibility. We're going to talk today a bit about how, if we think about functional load, we can divide this idea between accent and intelligibility or comprehensibility based on the relative importance of different sounds and how impactful certain errors or non-target like productions are. And then, of course, in orthography and reading and writing, it goes both ways. We encode sounds as letters when we write, and we decode sounds from letters when we read. So these are mutually influential as a kind of constellation of things we have to consider in L2 phonology. Somehow in the middle of all this, we have this construct that we call a phoneme. So something that we think of abstractly as a P. And a P might then be used in a variety of lexical entries in our minds to create words. And then once we have words in our target language, that can influence how we perceive all of these different areas in L2 phonology. So just to keep in mind that it's an interactive system with multiple components, and it's not necessarily a first one, then the other kind of progression, as we'll be talking about it today. So I'm going to start by going over, or continue by going over a few of the big ideas in L2 phonology. So starting with perception, and one of the things we need to, one of the things that's good to know about perception is what tools of the trade we have. So typically for perception research, we are measuring accuracy and maybe also reaction times in terms of like milliseconds. We'll find effects that shift someone's response time by 50 milliseconds, and we'll be able to detect that in our experiments. And this is usually done by a handful of common tasks or task families. One family would be the discrimination family. Can you tell these two sounds apart? Categorization is related, but involves grouping sounds together. So it's kind of forming an abstraction, which may be at various levels. And then we have identification, which is to indicate which sound we think something was. And if you've heard of perceptual assimilation, that's where this fits in the general family of things. We're identifying a sound, but we also pair it with goodness of fit. And then there's lexical decision tasks, where the basic question might be, is this a real word, or is this the right word that you're supposed to be listening to based on some stimulus? The advantage of the earlier types is that they don't require labels. We don't need to have them write anything in order to do it. And as we get farther down on the slides here, the challenge gets to be, can we have learners do this before they know how to write a word, or before they even have a vocabulary in the target language? So we use different tasks to answer different questions with different limitations placed on our due to our populations. Another thing we should keep aware of is that perception can actually change what we're hearing before it reaches our minds to be stored. So our L1, our native language, will influence and kind of filter our intake from the environment. So for example, German has this CH that's kind of notorious. It can be pronounced either h, like in the same position as a K, or as a palatal th, depending on its context. These are related, but acoustically, the h is kind of similar to an H, but we'll find that because there's this rule that H's can't be at the end of a syllable in English or in German, that learners of German will eventually start processing h and kind of reinterpreting it as a K, even though that would identify the wrong word. So that'll happen based on restructuring of the sound based on where it's allowed to appear, or where they think it's allowed to appear, until they figure out that it's in fact a different sound. And then we have this also on the syllable level. We can show that one syllable, blue, can be perceived, in fact, as two syllables. So it's not just a matter of accent and production, but whether they even hear one or two syllables. So these are things we have to keep in mind. There's a lot going on even before we've entered something in our mental lexicon. So I'm going to quickly go through a variety of models to kind of point out the major ideas that they contribute to the field of L2 phonology. And I've included the link to the slides in the chat, and I'll provide it again later if you'd like to go over these in more detail. But these are very brief and fast reviews of the models. So please feel free to ask questions about them later, or to go back to them later. First of all, the feature competition model, which doesn't get a lot of attention, is a cross-language perception model, and also tries to predict which segments from a native language will be transferred into a target language. And it does this rather than dealing with plus minus features of voiced, voiceless or something. It actually deals with proportions of a feature being useful or relevant in the language. So if it is used to separate a bunch of words, it gets a higher relative proportion or prominence. And if it's kind of not commonly relied on to differentiate words, it gets a lower prominence. And that prominence then biases our perception. So L1 prominence will bias how well we can listen to these contrasts in an L2. And so low prominence features might not be readily detected. And then this also makes predictions that saying what we are likely to misperceive a sound as in the beginning versus the end of a word, for example. So it makes some predictions about misperceptions and substitutions. The phonological interference model comes a few years later, thinks very carefully about auditory perception versus phonetic perception, which is a low-level kind of category of grouping of sounds, and then phonemic perception, which is more like what's going in our mental lexicon. And the idea here is that the features exist independent of segments, but they're arranged in a kind of geometrical hierarchy, and the basic premise of this model is simply that if you have a feature in your L1 already, even if it's used for a different contrast, then you can use it again to form a new contrast. But if you lack that feature, you will have a lot of difficulty, or it won't even be possible to learn a new contrast according to this model. And so the idea here is simply that your L1 features constrain or kind of limit what features you're going to be able to use in learning in L2. The perceptual assimilation model is one you've probably heard of before. It was originally formulated for cross-language listening, but has been expanded for second language listening for those who are actually L2 learners, and that it becomes an important distinction in the field. PAM essentially assumes that we have two languages existing in a space interacting at both phonetic and phonological levels, and that we deal with perceived similarity and assimilation of new sounds to familiar sounds. One of the problems with this model, though, is it's not really predictive. It talks about what the difficulty would be based on what that association would be or that assimilation would be, but it doesn't tell us what these assimilations are going to be in advance, so we can't really make predictions based on it. There's been a lot of work done on that anyway. With direct mapping of acoustics to phonology, or DMAP, we're also dealing with feature theory, and here we're dealing with a couple major ideas, and that is that it may be that phonological contrasts, our ability to perceive the difference between sounds, and phonological contrasts, like what we enter in our mental lexicon, the difference between a P and a B, for example, or phonetic categories, the ability to perceive the difference between those things, may actually operate with a little bit of independence, so that it's not necessarily hear first, then be able to produce. It could potentially go in a different order. And DMAP mainly focuses on an order of operations, saying that the more features you have to learn and update, the longer it will take to learn a new sound. And I won't go into any more detail on that, but the idea is it is a feature-based theory in terms of trying to predict kind of an order of operations for acquiring a new sound in the L2. And then finally, one thing we have is another model we have is automatic selective perception by Winifred Strange, which is a very purely phonetic-oriented thing. It leaves out anything that deals with lexicon or meaning-based stuff or top-down effects. And it basically is a model of clear definitions. We get multiple types of salience, whether it's auditory salience or perceptual salience. We have different types of attention. But the key issue in ASP is whether we are listening to a given thing in a phonetic mode, which is what we might do when we're first learning a sound or as L2 learners, or in a phonological mode, which we would do with things in our native language that we're already used to processing, or once we are advanced in the L2 and have learned to automatize that routine. So basically, it's a matter of learning it until it's automatic for us, and then we consider that acquisition in this model. And then finally, L2LP, the second language linguistic perception model. Its earliest framing is is an optimality theory and very abstract computational models, but here we have even more levels, the idea of acoustic representation, phonetic, phonemic, and lexical representations. But here the key is that your L1 phonological categories are copied to make an initial starting place for your L2 categories. And then these exist side by side, separately, through your learning process, so that the L2 categories can be updated based on recognition that, oh, I heard that, I thought it was this sound, it should have been categorized as this sound based on what I know about words, so let me move my boundaries in the L2. And so the idea is gradual incremental shift of boundaries based on the information we get in our input. But crucially, it leaves the L1 phonology intact. It means that learning a foreign language should not affect how we perceive the boundaries of our native language, which is in contrast to some of the other models. So I just want to state briefly to keep in mind, what is perception when it comes to questions like comprehensibility? Well, for one thing we have to keep in mind is that perception affects the intake of our learners. So what they're hearing in the first place affects what they can put in their mental lexicon, which then would have a chain effect to have impact on what they will produce later. It's not the only impact on what they'll produce when they try to talk, but it is an impact. And then we also have to keep in mind that native speakers also have their own perceptual filters that they're listening to. They might not be as flexible as needed to accommodate some of what they hear from L2 speakers. So at this point, I'll go ahead and hand over to Lisa to talk a bit about some models and methods in production.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, we're probably all familiar with it as researchers. How do we measure production? Usually that's done or can be done through tests of reading aloud, so like word list readings or sentence readings, or we can elicit speech production by having students or participants read out narratives or describe pictures. Or we can also have spontaneous speech production or semi-spontaneous speech production where in form of an interview of some sort. And then we can analyze this either phonetically or and acoustically and say Pratt or by transcribing it through a phonetician. But there are also the native listener judgments that we're going to talk about in a second here when it comes to comprehensibility. The speech learning model by Flege in 1995 is a model that is exclusively focused on production. And it's a purely phonetic model in which sounds are regarded as isolated. So they're not abstract categories as they would be in, say, PAM, for example. And the L1 categories of sounds are serve as magnets or attractors of the closest L2 sounds. And it's hypothesized that this inhibits category formation of a new L2 sound. So the SLM assumes that the state of production already gives us automatically a clue about the state of the perception of the speaker. So based on this assumption, perception necessarily always precedes production. But we do have data that speaks against this. So we're going to look at that later. Okay, so just to dive into this a little more in more detail, Flege hypothesizes that contrary to what, or a little counterintuitively to what we might think, is that the sounds that are similar, the L2 sounds that are similar to any given L1 sound are actually difficult for us to produce because they resemble that sound too closely, but they're not identical. If they're identical, then it would be easy. So then that means that new sounds that are completely absent from our phonetic inventory should be easier to learn. And then a new category can be established. We don't have to play those audios, by the way, John. Ooh. Ooh. Okay, we played them. Anyways. You can go ahead, yeah. So contrary to what was hypothesized in the critical period hypothesis, that after a certain age, after you hit a certain age, it's impossible to acquire a second language. Flege says that even late learners maintain all the capacities used in successful L1 speech acquisition and can transfer that to L2 speech acquisition as well. So developing the L2 phonetic system along with the already existing L1 phonetic system means that both of them will exist in a common space that then forms the interlanguage, or is considered the interlanguage. So the L1 influences the L2, but the L2 also influences the L1. I just wanted to do a quick experiment with you guys here by having you listen to 3 utterances and rate their accentedness on this scale at the bottom here. So I hope to do this quickly. So my recommendation would be to just write down the number on a sheet of paper or, before you share it in the chat with us. And then, yeah, provide a rating based on the degree of accent you believe this utterance has. So 1, no foreign accent, 9, very thick foreign accent, and then you get to choose anything in between, of course, that you deem appropriate. Okay.
I think that this might be a good idea after all. We actually went on a trip to Italy last year. So then we went to the village and I forgot my vest.
Okay, I hope this wasn't too fast. So you should have 3 separate ratings now, of course, for each of these. Okay. should we have them shared in the chat now, John, or afterwards? Yeah, now? Okay. So if you want, you can provide your ratings or share your ratings in the chat with us that you gave for, just type, oh, okay, perfect. So Dr. Philip already, okay. Okay, 1, 7. Okay, so I think we do see a pattern there. Okay. Thank you. Moving on to the functional load principle is, and this is quite important here because we may actually realize that not all sounds matter equally to us when it comes to understanding an utterance. So that means somebody can still have an accent, right? And it can still be comprehensible. And that means it depends on what the mispronunciations are. So for example, some segments in English are said to carry a higher functional load. That means the work they do individually to distinguish words based on the basis of that one sound. So for example, rock and lock, bar and ball, pray and play only work based on the distinction of R and L. So that's a quite crucial one, whereas other ones might not be so crucial, other sounds. So with that in mind, what I would like you to do now is we'll listen to these utterances again, but this time I would like you to not focus on the degree of accent. We've already established that, but how well do you understand this utterance? How much effort do you have to put to understand the utterance? And it works in a similar way. So on the left edge of the scale, you find it very easy to understand. And on the right edge of the scale, you find it extremely difficult to understand. And then let's see what happens.
That this might be a good idea after all. I think that this might be a good idea after all. We actually went on a trip to Italy last year. So then we went to the village and I forgot my vest.
Okay, once you have your ratings ready, you can share them again. Okay. So I know this might be difficult to see for you right now, and this is just a trend we're observing, but we can see that the numbers for the accentedness ratings were significantly higher, I should say, I hope it's significant, but right now we see lower ratings, which means that despite the presence of an accent in those recordings, we can still understand the speakers, me, quite well, irrespective of that. Of course, you do have to put more effort, but I don't think anybody somebody put an 8 here, which is extremely close to extremely difficult. But yeah, so they do not necessarily correlate, right? And this is exactly, thanks, John. And this is exactly why we have to disentangle these two principles here, the nativeness principle versus the intelligibility principle coined by Levis here. So we find it pretty futile to focus on accent reduction and make our students sound like native speakers, because that goal is not just unattainable, but it's also not even necessary if our speakers are in fact comprehensible. So why would you make them feel deficient by saying, okay, you have to lose your accent now? Therefore, as we just saw in our little ratings there, we see that these two concepts do not necessarily correlate, and that somebody can be perfectly intelligible and comprehensible. And that's a realistic goal to have, and that is actually teachable if we select the right sounds for training. Speaking of which, not speaking of which, but we just talked about perception and production here, and I would like to dive into exemplar theory at this point. That is from the field of psychology and has gained attention in the past years for perceptual training as well. So it deals with the categorization of objects and comparing new stimuli with existing ones without abstraction. That's the basic of the model. So each instance, say, of a sound is compared to other instances from past experience that we have stored in a memory cloud, a database, so to speak. And we later then form categories based on these experiences by lumping together similar exemplars. So we can interpret highly variable data without effort. And of course, that means that learning our L2 is going to be a little bit slower because it competes with the exemplars that we have in our compartments from the L1. So we have to expand that cloud first. And in this model, unlike a Flege, it suggests, or the SLM, it suggests that perception and production exist in a loop-like relationship where both condition each other. So me producing certain sounds will automatically lead to new exemplars that I set up by perceiving them at the same time. So with the original theory, there is a little bit of an issue in the linguistic area or in the pronunciation area, because it suggests that there's no abstraction at all. So, and this formulation is rather strong because we do have phonological evidence that there is some degree of abstraction. So if we recall the concept of phonetic categories in the perception models earlier, for example. And the weaker version that allows us to say there is a degree of abstraction or categorization allows for both the assembly of abstract categories based on exemplar groups and the retention of rich data from individual speech events, such as the social status of a speaker or what they look like, if it's a male or female voice, and so on and so forth.
So now I'll go ahead and introduce, going from the big theory and broad strokes of ideas in the field, we're going to take a look at an emerging treatment called high variability phonetic training and its cousin low variability phonetic training, and kind of take a look at how these can take the theoretical underpinnings that we've talked about into our interventions, which we're still trying to learn about for possible methods. So first we have to keep in mind, what is high variability phonetic training? Well, what we're trying to do is introduce a bunch of exemplars in varied phonetic contexts so that learners can take the bundles of these examples and generalize them into categories and thus be better prepared to receive new examples of sounds from multiple speakers, and also be able to transfer. There's an assumption that this will eventually transfer from their ability to perceive into their ability to produce. Now, it's high variability because we use multiple talkers, so they're getting a wider variety of examples that are acoustically different. My mouth is different from her mouth and from his mouth, so we all make different sounds. And of course, each time we say a word, even an individual person has slight differences. So if we wanted to have less variability, we would have low variability phonetic training, a single talker, but multiple instances of them saying it. So we get much less variability. It's constrained in a smaller box. But conceptually, the two are essentially the same treatment. And there's a lot of HVPT studies out there. In fact, Lisa has been working on reviewing them for her dissertation. She's got about 40 of them that she's currently reviewed. But what we find is that they all look at very different pieces of a very big puzzle. As you can see, here's some ideas of some of what those pieces might look like on the screen here. Now, overall, we get the picture that HVPT is a successful kind of intervention, but there's so many different variables to either control for or to manipulate to figure out how to use them that we have that, we still don't know all we need to know to do good, solid classroom implementation. So we have mixed results. We have different variables that we've looked at, but ultimately it's kind of like going into a warehouse where we know there's something great in here. It's really big and it's got many moving parts, but we're using a flashlight to find what we're looking at. So we get clear pictures of the studies of different pieces without necessarily having a sense of how to assemble the whole thing to best advantage. So we're going to start by showing, by quickly going through a couple, well, 3 examples of studies that look at very specific issues before we introduce 3 studies that we are doing or about to do at University of Calgary. So first is this one here, an HVPT study by Giannakopoulou and et al. And it's dealing, they looked at Greek children and at Greek adults who were trying to learn the L2 English E-I contrast. And they did 10 hours of training, some with 1 voice and some with 4 voices, to get a sense of the effect of variability. They found that both groups did better with low variability, just the 1 voice, and children actually showed a detriment with high variability, which is not normal for what we find with a lot of our adult studies in HVPT. But their design could not address low proficiency adults, because there weren't any in the study, and it couldn't. In fact, we had a great variation between children who had 1 to 2 years of experience and adults who had 9 to 13 years of experience. So it's really far apart, but not just one factor, it's age and proficiency. And so to address this, we would want to see studies that address 2 adult groups, beginners and advanced. And we'd also want to take a look at low versus high variability and no training at all to compare the 3 groups to see what the relative effects of each are. Now I'll hand it to Lisa to talk about the next study.
Yeah, so the studies that interested me for my dissertation was the one by Hazan et al. So they looked at L1 Japanese speakers of English, listening to the VB contrast and the RL contrast in 2 different conditions. And the effect of HVPT was measured in 10 sessions of 40 minutes training each, and they were exposed to 5 talkers. They also compared the effect of audio-visual versus audio-only and visual-only feedback, and found that the perception of the RL contrast improved, no matter if it was audio-visual or audio, but that audio-visual was more effective when the visual cues were salient. So that means R and L can be are difficult to distinguish by just looking at the gesture, but sounds like V and B might be easier to distinguish. So what their design couldn't address, though, was that there's no comparison to LVPT, and as John suggested earlier, that might be worth looking into. And they also didn't use real faces in various settings. So they had the talking heads. And a design that would address it that I would prefer is that compares low and high variability phonetic training to each other and that uses real talkers. A second study by Thompson looks at highly educated L1 Mandarin speakers of English and the effect of 12 to 20-minute training over the course of 3 weeks. And they used 20 different speakers to train them on individual sounds of English, and those were, I think, 20 sounds. And there was significant improvement, and that transferred to one novel phonetic context with retained effects. And they also found that certain talkers were more efficient than others. So that also suggests that there might be some highly individual detail to these speakers. And what their design couldn't address, though, was a transfer to production, as the HVPT training suggests there will be. And it doesn't show us if audio-visual training, so seeing people's faces, would be more effective than audio only. Including a production task here at the end, and comparing this to low variability phonetic training and using an audio-visual component could have enhanced this too.
So now we're going to move into talking about what we're looking at University of Calgary for current and upcoming research in the areas we've talked about. And we'll start with acquisition of L2 sound spelling correspondences, a study that we have done last year and we're still analyzing the data from. So when we're dealing with orthographic learning, because most of us are dealing with literate learners who are adults or at least literate children, we have to keep in mind that phonological awareness is also dependent on what literacies students bring to the table. If they are illiterate versus literate, they have different cognitive effects on how they deal with speech sounds. And we can also deal with the fact that writing systems are, the learning scenarios are quite diverse. Sometimes you have to learn a new writing system. So if you're an English speaker learning Arabic or Arabic learning English, you're learning a whole new writing system. Or you might be dealing with a different script, one alphabet versus another alphabet. Or you might be dealing with a different orthography, same alphabet, really different rules for usage to indicate what the sounds are supposed to be. So these are all different kinds of cognitive challenges that we look at in the field. And this means that research in this area is actually spread kind of thinly across these areas. There's some great research in each area, of course, but just not enough to really answer all of our questions. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when we're dealing with spelling as literate learners, we're learning grapheme phoneme correspondences. We're learning how to match letters with sounds that we hear. Even in the same script, these can be used quite differently. And so say between English and German or French, we might get, there's no congruence between how letters are used in one language to indicate sounds versus how they're used to indicate sounds in another language. And there's also different degrees of consistency. English and French are rated at the very low consistency end. There's a lot of different ways to match up sounds and letters in those languages, as opposed to Spanish and German, which are on the high consistency end of the scale. So if you look at the examples at the bottom and you focus on the black, you'll see that this is how we can take the same letters that will encode a variety of sounds across languages. If you focus on the red, you'll see that we can take the same sound and encode it through a bunch of different letters within each language. And these are examples of these notions of congruence and consistency. So with our studies that we're dealing with, we want to give some sense of the context. And this is relevant very much to our spelling study. In Western Canada, we have, we of course, like everybody, we're dealing with phonological acquisition beginning even prenatally and of course continuing right after birth. And then we introduce orthographic awareness at a young age. Now, when we get the students at the university to learn German, we're typically giving them sounds and letters on the same day, right from day one, and learning simultaneously from that point. So it differs from L1 acquisition in that regard. We also have a population that have a good chunk of the population who have taken some French, middle school or high school before they get there. So for them, German is an L3, and we have 2 languages in the mix. So we looked at comparing these groups. Before I move on, I want to indicate that we are acknowledging the difference between pre-learners who are doing cross-language perception and L2 learners who have some different cognitive stuff going on, as articulated by PAM-L2. So our task looked like this. We actually gave them a 92-word oral spelling list, a dictation kind of list online, where they just heard real German words. And then we asked them to spell it to the best of their ability. For example, they might hear this.
Wacht.
And they could play it as many times as they wanted to.
Wacht.
And this is before they'd ever taken a German class. Use what you think letters do to spell this word. We got data like these. So Wacht is in the second column, and we focused on what sound we were shooting for in each particular word for our various conditions. And so then we coded the results based on a few questions. First, did they spell it right in German? We didn't expect high scores for this before they'd taken any German, but then we also coded each response for whether it was a way to spell another way to spell that same sound in a given language. Is it a way to spell an adjacent or very similar sound in that language, or is it clear that they're just hearing a different word and writing that down instead? And we're still analyzing some of these results for English and French, but we've got them analyzed for the German. And then we actually compared over time points before any German, and then we used words from their vocab lists at the end of the semester, and then we also used similarly structured words that they had never seen before at the end of the semester for the same task. And what we found is that they do improve their spelling rapidly, and then they also do generalize to novel vocabulary, not as thoroughly as to familiar words. But we also found that, say, you could get L2 effects on L3 that would potentially benefit, like French R seemed to help perception of German R, whereas French R seemed to make it problematic to perceive the German H sound, which is acoustically similar but spelled differently. And this basically brings our attention to the fact that we need more explicit instruction on novel target language spelling sound relationships, and we should be thinking about the construction of our vocabulary lists with how well they represent these sounds and, in fact, their typical spellings in the language. So basically, this varies by language, but the idea of it's spelled like it sounds is a problematic one. And we have to keep in mind that perception and literacies both come into play. And there's a whole bunch of factors that we still need to more thoroughly research, including potential interventions like HVPT. Which brings us to our first proposed study for the fall, which we were going to present these very briefly. And this is dealing with looking at both learner proficiency and degree of voice variability. So you've seen this slide before, and what we're going to try to do by introducing some training before they've even entered the German classroom is to simulate the L1 learning experience by having the oral exposures precede any orthographic exposure. And that's something we have that's common to the next 2 experiments. And in our first experiment, we want to look at the two major factors. First of all, we're going to look at 2 levels of proficiency. First semester, so they've had no German before, and then third semester, after they've had a year of university German or equivalent. And we also want to take a look at talker variability. So we'll look at 1 voice versus 4 voices, and we'll see how these two things interact. It's possible that more voices is more useful for higher proficiency, but maybe fewer voices is useful for lower proficiency, as we saw with the Greek children before. I won't go into the details of this, but we're going to focus on German consonants and German vowels that have been selected based on how to learn them. We're also going to include a sound spelling component that's kind of a replication of the previous study. And we'll do this with a pre-test and then post-test and delayed post-test format using an oddity task, so we don't need any labeling. It's just which of these sounds is not like the others, which then implicitly groups the other 2 as a category. And what this should show us, it won't be a replication of our previous study with the spelling, but it also expands to look at the development of category perception as it connects to orthography, which is not commonly done in literature. We'll get some sense of what level of variability is best for what proficiency level. And then we'll also be able to compare consonants and vowels side by side in a number of ways, because many studies focus on just a couple sounds, maybe 2 consonants or 2 vowels. And then we'll see, is 4 hours even enough to get these effects? And then I'll hand it over to Lisa to explain the final study.
Yeah, so my idea was for my dissertation work was to have a computer assisted pronunciation training program that allows our students or participants to have focused and unlimited access training in a stress-free environment. And the idea is to have them contrast sounds or German L2 sounds based on discrimination and identification practice, and then provide feedback that is relevant to the learner to help them retrieve, restructure, and consolidate their L2 phonological representations through repetition. I'm using this 4-square design here, so I'll increase the talker variability and for 1, which means going from 1 speaker. So 1 group will be exposed to 1 speaker only, and the other groups will be exposed to multiple speakers. And then I'll have an audio only component where they discriminate sounds and an audio visual component in the feedback, so that they'll see the face of the speaker that corrects them. So I'm still determining which sounds to look at here, and I'm doing this based on the functional load hierarchy that we talked about earlier, which exists for English, but not for German yet. I'm currently in the process of figuring that out. And my idea was to embed these critical sounds into CVC syllables, and they're supposed to be non-words, just in case because they will have had some exposure to German by the time we get the study running. And yeah, and then they'll receive 8 weeks of training 3 times per week for 15 minutes with the identification task and feedback in the different conditions. And then I'll also have them do production tasks at the sentence reading level and wordless reading level to see if this actually transfers onto production, whether there are differences in the modalities each group had. What this will hopefully show us is whether there's a benefit to having audio-visual feedback over audio feedback only. So it's basically a replication or an expansion of the Hasan study that I talked about earlier. And it'll also hopefully provide some insight whether LVPT or HVPT is more beneficial at such level of in beginner German learners. And then to have a side-by-side comparison of consonants and vowels of German, and whether this transfers onto production with a goal of increasing comprehensibility in production in the end.
So that's what we've got today. Thanks very much for coming in and listening to this. And hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion. I think there's been some questions in the chat. So thanks again. And we'll pull the slides down and open it up for discussion.
Thank you for your presentation. It was nice to see all of these different aspects in one go rather than the usual snippets or focus on one. It was very Very fascinating. I'd like to open it up for questions at this point. You can either write your question down in the chat and it will be read aloud, or you can use the raise hand function here in Zoom to ask a question yourself. We do have a question from the chat to start us off here. Laura asks, concerning native accent influence in L2 learning, what do you propose for teacher training colleges abroad? This was asked when we were doing the various listening tasks that you had.
Yeah, look in the chat to see if I can follow the details of the question too, because I saw it was written earlier there. See, so native accent influence in L2 learning. So in terms of intervention, it sounds like accent reduction is the focus of the question. Is that correct? From Laura? Is she still here? Yeah, there she is. Oh, there, okay, she's doing it in text. Okay, so in terms of native accent reduction, Lisa, you were talking about the comprehensibility versus intelligibility. Did you want to look at that or take that one?
Sure, yeah. So even for our teachers training colleges abroad, I think it's really important to, because your students might be ambitious after all, and they say like, hey, I want to, like I've always had students say like, I want to sound like a native speaker of my second language, and I put so much effort into it. And I would say it depends on, I mean, discouraging them would be somewhat cruel maybe, but it's actually fair to say that even if they don't achieve to have a native like accent, which is again not attainable for most second language learners or late learners, then we should really focus on showing them what matters, what will make their speech more comprehensible in their second language, and then really draw their attention to those individual sounds or features of speech that they need to work on in order to be intelligible and comprehensible speakers. So I wouldn't teach them or kind of give them the idea that they ought to sound like a native speaker in order to be understood, because that's just not true.
I can add to that one, luckily, if we're teaching English abroad, for example, that functional hierarchy has already been identified and published in terms of what are the most important segments to focus on. And so basically those are the ones you get the most bang for your buck. And we recognize there's a limited amount of time in the classroom or that you can use. So focusing on essentially top to bottom through that list is a good way to prioritize that kind of coaching essentially, but also maybe to help students prepare for the idea that non-native speakers rarely completely eliminate accent. And I put this in a joking frame for my students. Teaching German at the university, I tell them, like, I'm not trying to train you to be a Cold War spy. It's okay if you have an accent and people detect that you're an American or a Canadian, as long as you are able to be understood with everything you're intending to say, and it's not hard for Germans to follow what you're saying, which is really the, if you switch it on the ethical ground, usually students come around pretty well to that idea.
Great. So our next question, I'm not sure if this is for the study, the proposed study that John talked about or that Lisa talked about, but for your experiment, does production require reading? And do test participants have training in orthography of German as they do the test?
Just based on the time when it was posted, I assume this was about my study.
Well, the other two studies have no production component, so that's probably
and that too. And that too. Right.
Liz?
Marcia, is that correct?
Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So yes, it does require reading, definitely. So they have sentences that they'll read and a word list.
So my question is not into production, but preparing them, because if you're giving them this test before anyone has taken German, how will they know how to read it?
That's the other experiment. So Lisa's experiment is offset by about 6 weeks.
Okay, 6 weeks into the course, they should know how to read those words and sentences.
And based on last year's pilot data from the spelling, we see that at least with vocabulary words and to some generalizability, at the end of 12 weeks, they clearly are starting to learn these spelling conventions. Not perfectly, but they're getting them much better.
Is this just by being shown them or by being taught them?
So there's a vocabulary list that they encounter. We also, like many foreign language textbooks, have one page that introduces the alphabet and the sounds that go with it. And so typically we'll give a 50-minute session and then we'll move on. But that is what we're proposing here, is ways to improve on this, one day of spelling and sounds.
Okay, thank you.
While we're talking about this study, there was a question as to how many subjects will be included in your study, Lisa.
In my study, so yeah, typically we have 150 or about 150 students enrolled in our German beginner courses at the U of C, more or less. I don't expect to end up with at least half of that, but so I'm hoping or shooting for 60 to 80, but that is yeah.
Yeah, from experience, it's actually optimistic. One thing I can say is that we motivate this recruitment based on how many we're trying to get in each group for good statistical analysis. So for our studies, we have like in the first study that I presented has not only 2 levels of proficiency, but it also has 2 levels of variability, and then we have is we want to deal with 3 groups based on variability, and in each of those groups we want to be able to have 20 to 25, ideally, participants, so that we can run really reliable stats on that. Frequently, we end up with more like 12 to 15, and we still kind of get by in this field. But it's really just a matter of, can we get enough to make reliable statistical analyses for each subgroup of the experiment.
Yeah.
Great. And again, because it's related to the study that we're discussing, another question was, for showing the talker heads, is it important to have different and real talker heads because it contributes to the variability the learners are exposed to, but visually rather than perceptually? Or is it just generally to help them visualize the gestures, and one talker would be just as useful?
This is an excellent question, and I've been trying it's precisely what I'm trying to get at here. So remember this one study that I talked about where they had the talking heads, and this was based on the gesture, and they tried to have the gesture aid the learner detect which sound it was, right? But that doesn't always work quite well because, say, for example, if I say German "oo" and German "ü," I have pretty much the same gesture, but there's still 2 different sounds. One is a back-rounded vowel and the other one is a front-rounded vowel. And the idea with exemplar theory is, and that's why I want to use real faces, is because it's not so much, or not only the gesture that can be helpful, because in some cases it's not, but just the instance of memorizing the rich detail along with a speaker. So for example, the theory posits that you'll keep track, or you'll memorize what you hear in that instance, but everything that comes with it. So for example, you'll remember, is the speaker, I don't know, a tall person? Is it a person with authority? Is it a man? Is it a woman? Or things like you infer. That all comes along with it. And that's where that's the rich detail you'll store along with the utterance, and not so much just the gesture.
If I can, we cited a study in one slide that came out. It was actually a talk last week in terms of cutting edge research, and that's the Hayes-Harben-Barrios study that highlighted with stick figures who was speaking, teacher or fellow student in a class. And they found that just highlighting that it was the teacher speaking, whether they did counterbalance, it wasn't the voice itself, but highlighting that it was the teacher speaking actually meant that for learning VOT, like voiceless divisions in English, they could, the ones that were understood as being teacher utterances were considered more important to the learners in the experiment than the ones that were given by their classmates. So even little cues like your teacher is speaking are part of that exemplar that Lisa is talking about.
Yeah, precisely.
Thank you. So another question that came up, are some of these studies supporting the model of the old audiolingual method that exposure to spoken language should precede written language?
I can tackle this one. This is I don't actually work with audiolingual, so I can't speak to the details of that particular model. But what I am trying to do is to see with this experiment whether we can, in advance of going into class, warp the perceptual space to be predisposed to hear the categories that they will then get labels for in the class. So in that regard, it simulates in microcosm, on the chronological scale, it would maybe simulate L1 acquisition, because we know this is the natural acquisition case for children. They always get a couple of years of exposure to sounds before we start teaching them letters. But then they walk into a foreign language classroom at a university and it's like, Guten Tag, and we write it on the board as we say it. So but that means that they potentially have interference from what they think spelling means at that moment before they've had a chance to form proper categories. We don't see studies, largely because classrooms don't usually start before the class starts, but we don't see a lot of studies that look at introducing training for sounds in advance of orthography. So it's really kind of uncharted territory, but I don't have to frame it in audiolingual to get a sense of how it might affect the learning process. We know that through exposure to L2 sounds, we start to change the boundaries of the perceptual space. And so ideally, we can prime them a little bit through a few hours of exposure to just sounds and some focus on that, so that then when we give them labels, they can apply those labels in the classroom more effectively.
Great, thank you. So I think we have time for one more quick question before we end here. What type of connections might you predict for these two studies that you propose between orthographic knowledge and the HVPT? Or do you expect there to be any connection between those two variables within the study design?
With the spelling, we're still in kind of mostly uncharted territory. There's not a lot of research that looks at spelling in connection with sound. There are some scholars working in this area, Vivian Cook and Bassetti. These are areas where we deal with L2 orthography, but so far that literature isn't connecting so well to L2 perception of sounds. And so we're not really sure what to expect here, especially because we're also dealing with the fact that we have an L1 English, potentially L2 French. So these are low consistent languages in terms of how the spelling and sounds match up. Learning German, which is a high consistent language. So that means that our learners might not even be predisposed to cognitively use spelling for all that it can do for them because of their previous language experience. So we're kind of, it's hard to answer that in any detail at this point because there are very few studies dealing with alphabet to alphabet learning within the Roman script. So hopefully next year I can tell you more on that actually.
I look forward to it. All right, so with that, we will unfortunately need to conclude today's program as we are out of time. Again, today's presentation was titled Perception, Pronunciation, Orthography, and High Variability Phonetic Training in Foreign Language. We wish to thank our presenters. Thank you both for coming and joining us today and discussing this very interesting topic with us.
I see a couple questions weren't answered yet, so if we don't have to stick with it, but please feel free to email me. That's at john.scott@ucalgary.ca if you have additional questions, because sometimes these things come later. I would look forward to it.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so with that, this will conclude our program for today, and you may now disconnect. Thank you, everyone.